Somehow, in the field of culture as elsewhere, the results of bourgeois society and historical progress, long conceived as a coordinated forward march of the human mind, were different from what had been expected. After the new Germany had actually come into being, the textbooks of literary history confidently forecast the imminence of this golden age, but by the end of the century such optimistic prognoses turned into glorification of the classical heritage against contemporary writing seen as disappointing or, in the case of modernists, undesirable. In the European battle between ancients and moderns, engaged at the end of the 17th century and so evidently won by the moderns in the Age of Revolution, the ancients, now no longer situated in classical antiquity, were once again winning. This was eminent historian Eric Hobsbawm describing artistic currents running through Europe in the late 19th century. The cultural tastes of the hereditary aristocracy, enjoying centuries of divinely ordained dominance, were held to be just self-evidently superior to what counted for mass folk culture, seen as rooted in superstition and fable. But by the end of the 19th century, this dusty order of landowners, creaking under the weight of genetically dubious family trees, enormous tracts of land, and a vastly depleted peasantry to manage it, was suddenly forced to cede ground to the bourgeoisie, a new elite, catapulted to power off the back of the Industrial Revolution. This, in turn, created an unprecedented realignment of elite culture. The speed at which the new bourgeoisie arose to economic dominance left no time for them to establish a cultural identity, distinct from the aristocratic at one end, or the folk culture at the other. The obvious choice was to align with aristocratic tastes as a means of fast-tracking their way to intellectual elitism, a clear cultural superiority that supplemented their dramatic economic dominance over the proletariat. But what did the stuffy vestiges of this elite culture, the art galleries, symphony halls, opera houses and museums, what did these have to say about the future, or even the present for that matter? Equally, a new form of mass culture was arising at this time to prominence to claim ownership of the contemporary soul. Mass advertising campaigns, new styles of art such as cartoons, cinema, popular theatre, sketches, all sprung from the fertile soil of industrial-era technology, all appeared low and vulgar in the eyes of the bourgeoisie, despite the fact that they were absolutely indispensable in maintaining their material dominance. With one hand, the bourgeoisie asserted that there was not only such a thing as highbrow culture that was self-evidently superior, but one that also provided a vision of the future. Yet, highbrow, to any casual observer, increasingly resembled a glorification of the classical heritage, an obsolete appendage of a decaying order. It took an apocalyptically devastating world war to finally bring these contradictions to bear. Older artists, once considered the bulwark of imperial triumphs such as Edward Elgar, found themselves unable to metabolize the horrors of modern warfare, thus falling back on tragedian romantic forms to give voice to their sorrow. But even this seemed somehow unable to encompass the scale of death and suffering to a society unaccustomed to such things, the 19th century that ran up to the First World War being a period of relative peace in Europe. It was left to a new emerging avant-garde to give voice to the illogical, self-destructive anime that swept Europe in the wake of the First World War, expressing this through the aesthetics and materials of the still new mass culture itself: Dada, German expressionism, cinema, jazz, serialism and germinal blues. The voice of interworn nihilism was understood through the framework of mass culture, far from the traditional corridors of an old elite. The decline of the hereditary order created vast cultural upheavals we are still grappling with today, something that goes beyond merely contesting the meaning and legitimacy of high and low culture and what this actually means. Like, who gets to speak for the present, and who is shaping the future from a cultural perspective? Today, traditional media, meaning primetime TV and art distributed by top-down institutions in the form of radio, major labels and larger booking agents, they engage in a similar dance of assumed ownership over the zeitgeist, but are beginning to look like irrelevant appendages to many. Equally, a new form of guerrilla content from podcasts, streamers, YouTubers and influencers pose a serious threat to an older bourgeois dominance, and as a result are characterized by traditional media figures, not illegitimately, as vulgar and disposable as a result. And much like the original explosion of mass culture at the end of the 19th century, all exist at the behest of very powerful industrialists who despise their user base. And growing out of this moment, much like pre-war Europe, is a pervasive anxiety regarding human progress. The assumption that society is moving in one continuous upward line, guided by rational, liberal institutions, now looks like maybe a brief accident of the post-war settlement. Of the late 19th century, Hobsbawm continues, what led the avant-garde artists forward was therefore not a vision of the future, but a reversed vision of the past. Often indeed, as in architecture and music, they were eminent practitioners of the styles derived from traditions which they abandoned only because, like the ultra-Wagnerian Schoenberg, they felt them incapable of further modification. Architects abandoned ornament as Art Nouveau pushed it to its extremes. Composers tonality as music drowned in post-Wagnerian chromaticism. Then as now, cultural progress, when it occurs at all, takes the form of fiddling at the edges, adding footnotes and addendums to established modes. Then, as now, new forms of culture, that loose conglomeration of digital activity we now refer to as content, these are seen as illegitimate usurpers in the eyes of the traditional bourgeois power. One could go further. If culture still plays a role in documenting and directing society's soul in some sense, it no longer takes place in the traditional arts at all. Music, TV, film, theatre, visual arts all have degraded into pastiche, nostalgia, or reversed visions of the past. A process coinciding with an emergent class of tech entrepreneurs rebranding themselves from traditional capitalists to sages, philosophers, and even deities. Their products, ideas and lifestyles are sold as capturing the imagination of the present and shaping the future, never mind that the actual results of all of their efforts are often little more than a series of online scams. Traditional modes of creativity look tired and spent by comparison. Unable to move out of the long shadow of the mysterious blip spanning the decades between 1950 and 1999, a period where culture followed clear patterns of progress, influence, a chronology we now endlessly map out into neat fossil records. Young people who choose to listen to old rock music, willfully immersing themselves in obsolete culture, are clearly in flight from the 21st century, all of its restrictions and privations, its corporate sterility, its double-locked doors, its stone-faced denial of financial freedoms granted to previous post-war generations. These kids have to worry more about their own security and solvency than their parents or grandparents ever did. And these days, they're expected to care more deeply about other people too. This can be tiring for the young, and so, for those who've only ever known the modern world, Zeppelin offer a quick taste of the 70s, wild ambition, technical brilliance, unself-conscious absurdity, and a blurry line between personal liberty and doing whatever the hell you like. Did you know that more music was released in a single day in 2024 than the entirety of 1989? Who is bearing witness to such blatant overproduction? Who is stewarding all this content? The question of whether metal is inescapably obsessed with its past has haunted me for some time. Since its inception, metal has always been dominated by regressive and progressive impulses, but our relationship to history pervasively haunted the imagination of metal by the 2010s, supplanting authenticity as the dominant concern among some fans. Even moves to explicitly reject the past in various progressive permutations looked oddly anachronistic. Any culture, if it continues for long enough, it does reach a kind of critical mass where the sheer quantity of material, lionized works and agreed norms accumulated over decades begins to weigh down on the present to the point of paralysis. A genre ossifies under its own canon. But even this claim requires some interrogation, I suppose, tempting us into idealizing a past that was every bit as fraught with identity crises and creative hesitation, perhaps. The music journalist Simon Reynolds perfectly articulated a lot of these concerns in his book Retromania. Originally published in 2011 at the dawn of the pastiche decade, many of its observations are perhaps commonplace by now. The internet offers unprecedented access to history. The transition from dial-up connections to broadband accelerated its shift from a popular but specialist tool to a ubiquitous utility. The sheer volume and stockpiling of past cultures disincentivizes novelty. The exponential progress of technology shifted the focus away from the substance of culture itself to the means of its transmission, and by the 2000s pop culture had over 50 years of material and history to draw upon, placing an unbearable weight on the present. The documentation, classification, and archiving of record collections, as facilitated by the iPod and later by Spotify, fed the already pre-existing complexes of music fandom, encouraging the collector mentality to ever greater excesses as we gorge ourselves on content. The advent of sites like Discogs and Rate Your Music, and indeed Metal Archives, heralded a new form of passive fandom. Cult-like communities that once felt borderline revolutionary ossify into quiet curation. Monk-like characters wander around online, carefully documenting all of recorded music history for posterity. All these are by now very familiar post-digital neuroses, but Reynolds also takes a longer view in his book, arguing that retromania is mappable at various times and locations throughout post-war history. In more obvious culprits such as Northern Soul maybe and the mod revival of the late 70s, but also in the 50s revivalism championed by Malcolm McLaren in the run-up to the punk explosion, or 20s jazz revivalists of the post-war period. These exist in direct contrast to pivotal moments when the present seemed to annex the future and give rise to movements too intense to last more than a few years. Late 60s psychedelia, the 1977 punk moment, and British rave of the early 90s, for example. But by the time I read this book in 2020, COVID had already bedded in, and the many features of retromania outlined by Reynolds look all but endemic, particularly for a genre arguably too aware of its history, such as metal. The best we can hope for from ostensibly experimental music is tweaking at the borders of possibility rather than radically redrawing the musical landscape. The ubiquity of the collector-curator mentality, a form of passive rather than active fandom, the transition from file sharing to streaming and playlist curation, recording technology itself, mashup, sampling, the maligned hipster as a rootless amalgamation of various cultural reference points, all are signs of cultural exhaustion, features of the landscape so familiar that we no longer see them as problematic. Running in tandem to this is the breakdown of mainstream consensus, both politically and culturally. The Super Bowl and Taylor Swift looking oddly conspicuous as rare, universally recognised touchstones. As a result, the traditional vectors of counterculture are no longer capable of disrupting society as they once did. This role has been taken up by the technology industry and insurgent political movements. For example, the years from 2015 to 2019 were deeply radicalising and exhilarating for me and many of my peers. But for me, this had nothing to do with music and everything to do with the 2017 general election in the UK. Contemporary music appears incapable of exploring the collective imagination of the present, leaning on endless feedback loops of pastiche and parody, ironically one step removed, experienced through a membrane of branding, choose-your-own trope package, and comfort. Grassroots radicalism has moved entirely online, expressed through insurgent mediums such as podcasting, memeing, commentary, influencer culture, and TikTok-style vignettes. The rise of this guerrilla content coincided with a time when film seemed incapable of existing outside of an established 20th century IP. TV defaulted to reboots and spin-offs, its so-called golden age evaporating under the slow collapse of the Game of Thrones narrative. The hipster, having blazed the trail of cultural nomadism throughout the 2000s, burst into the mainstream by the 2010s, with fashion and aesthetics manically cycling through different amalgamations of the past, hoping to hit pay dirt. Metal, although not directly discussed by Reynolds in his book, was a very clear casualty of retromania. But the growth of retro genres throughout the 2010s was not just a symptom of nostalgia, but of a craving for authenticity. Metal in the 2000s, for example, left an aftertaste of cynicism, of blatant artificiality, that it created a need in the fanbase for something that felt sincere, even if this meant simply repurposing retro aesthetics and forms as a shortcut to some reasonable simulation of realness. In some sense, this is nothing new. Any trend in metal that gains enough momentum will meet with a violent reaction in the opposite direction. Each paradigm shift creates warring factions. Minor points of scripture create huge and irreconcilable fissures. For all the ire that metalcore has attracted over the years, for example, in one sense it was a reassertion of traditional metal values in response to something like nu metal, the latter of which became a taboo par excellence in the metal community. Going further back, nu metal as an outgrowth of alt metal and grunge was a reaction to the metallic excesses of the late 80s. One way of understanding this process is framed by a recent article by Sam Criss, where, in his usual hyperbolically sardonic style, he discusses binary automaton, a form of vibe shifting that eats through history like a termite, converting everything into the opposite of itself. Binary automata are everywhere. I'm now old enough to have experienced 4 cycles of the skinny jeans, baggy jeans automaton. Somehow, every time it happens, people are still amazed that they managed to spend the last decade wearing such objectively incorrect jeans. Like waking out of a dream. How could you have possibly believed that these revolting things actually looked good? Then, a few years later, it switches the other way, and you're once again yelping in horror at your own trousers. The jeans automaton is a dialectic without sublation. It never goes anywhere, and nothing is ever learned. We're all doomed to repeat it for the rest of our lives. Equally, PR blurbs accompanying new releases often describe the music in this oppositional language, the tone echoing a young James Hetfield lambasting Motley Crue et al. We are not the other thing, we are the actual thing. The rhetoric of the 2010s was oddly insistent on reassurance, the real deal was back. Everything was put back into its proper place. Death metal was old school again. Black metal was once again covered in corpse paint. Retro thrash was cool. Speed metal contemporary. Stoner doom escapism was a possibility. The return of tight jeans, trainers and leather jackets. Statements of intent in stark opposition to new metal bagginess. Or the neutral jeans and t-shirts of post-metal. Equally, traditional heavy metal, surviving on nothing but Iron Maiden's fumes for so long, suddenly exploded into a cornucopia of bands embracing the most traditional imagery they could muster. 10 years previously, such gauche theatrics were unthinkable outside of small, hermetically sealed communities of the faithful. Into this opening, also, genuinely older bands sensed an opportunity to make a return. Second winds abound. Metallica abandoned whatever the fuck St. Anger was in favour of unambiguous metal. Black Sabbath's original lineup reformed to cobble together 13. John Garcia got his band back together. Justin Broadrick put Jesu out of its misery to return to Godflesh. A whole new generation of fans who had spent their youth ploughing the depths of history as if discovering pieces of long-forgotten lore suddenly found festival lineups and tour circuits flooded with names they thought to be long dead. Despite appearances, metal fans aren't idiots, though. Well, they could sense the cynicism behind some of this. But to some extent, they didn't care. The music was good enough to enjoy, and as long as we all bought into the fantasy, it would endure for as long as we wanted it to. But the memification of retro continued to bubble over until it became maybe impossible to ignore. Bands like Ghost invited fans to gorge themselves on retro comforts to such a degree that suspension of disbelief became too much to ask. Mysterious voices started whispering phrases like pizza thrash into the wind. Attitudes to blood incantation became a way to gauge the character of a man. Half a decade on from the 2010s then, the urgency of these questions are maybe less apparent. We have either accepted our lot or, seeing no alternative, have redoubled our efforts into buying into this fantasy and a kind of hypernormalization of retro. Hypernormalization is a word that was coined by a brilliant Russian historian who was writing about what it was like to live in the last days of the Soviet Union. In the 80s, everyone from the top to the bottom of Soviet society knew that it wasn't working, knew that it was corrupt, knew that the bosses were looting the system, knew that politicians had no alternative. And they knew that the bosses knew, and that they knew that they knew. Everyone knew it was fake. But because no one had any alternative vision for a different kind of society, they just accepted this sense of total fakeness as normal. In order to understand if the feeling of retromania is as potent as it was maybe 5 years ago, it may be useful to take a longer view of metal's evolution through the lens of nostalgia. 5 years doesn't feel like a very long time these days, until we remember the breadth and depth of the material that came out in a 5-year period between, say, 1985 and 1990. In assessing the present, then, it's important to problematize the past to an extent, and ask if we really are living through a unique period of paralysis, or existing in some monolithic paradigm shift that's occurring too incrementally for us to perceive on the ground. Has metal's history always been one continuous binary automaton? Or is it closer to long periods of equilibrium punctuated by brief but violent bursts of creativity? And what does this mean for metal in an age of multipolar crises? Was metal, in its original form, even a fundamentally new or forward-looking phenomenon? The answer to this question will in part depend on when you could justifiably call metal a fully autonomous entity. Popular wisdom may hold that metal began in 1970, the moment Tony Iommi hit the tritone on Black Sabbath's Black Sabbath from Black Sabbath, and there's no doubt that the track Black Sabbath from Black Sabbath by Black Sabbath was itself an aberration in rock to that point. The links forged with horror and occult themes, the appearance of the tritone itself in rock music at all, the greater use of power chords, the physical energy juxtaposed with sophisticated narrative forms, all constituted an outlying piece of data demanding careful observation. This, combined with the many anecdotes and nuggets of trivia offered by the band themselves on their mindset and influences at the time, this has led every TV documentary and mainstream written history on the subject to fixate on this milestone, characterizing it as a clean break with the past that forged a clear, unbroken narrative line from this point onwards.
But I'd argue that this wasn't the case.
Metal wasn't anything like this self-conscious, this tightly knit movement until nearly a decade later. The thing we now call metal did not instantaneously explode into a self-conscious genre after 1970. Sabbath's first 6 albums, whilst laying the foundations for various metal forms, are also extremely bipolar to modern ears. For every Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, there's a Sabracadabra, for example. Outside of prog and various permutations of avant-garde, the album format itself was still in its infancy and rarely conceived of as a cohesive artistic document as it is today. The disparate acts spanning heavy rock, prog, psych and blues in the late 60s were retroactively characterized as the old wave to the new wave of British heavy metal's new wave, so to speak. But they had none of the cohesion and self-consciousness we would normally attribute to a genre, despite the obvious reach of their influence on metal. And this, in a sense, is evidence of their utter indifference to the past or the future, simply creating for the sake of creating, with little regard for what it was called or what it said about their time and place. But the true metallic nature of Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, and even such acts as Thin Lizzy and Blue Cheer are all retroactively imposed on their music for the sake of forging a clear, unbroken link from Cream and Hendrix to the first rumblings of New Album. The enshrining of the Black Sabbath creation myth, neatly coinciding with the end of 60s optimism and the rise of album rock, is something each new generation of metal fans reinforces with historically obsessive compulsion. Metal histories documenting this era tend to take the form of milestone documentation, charting its evolution through a series of key artists and releases. But it may be helpful to view it as more of a diffuse mentality that slowly reached a degree of solidity by the end of the 70s. It's important to understand that none of these artists were consciously trying to create anything like heavy metal as we understand it now. Analysing Sabbath albums by segmenting off the metal from the heavy rock elements is a purely retrospective concoction. It should also be emphasised that, in terms of a mass audience, heavy guitar music fell from favour by the mid-70s, as people lost patience with its excesses and increasingly loose grasp on the working-class experiences of the average listener, a sense of stagnation that gripped rock music in the mid-70s after the euphoria of Woodstock finally ebbed away. Prog, the closest thing rock had to an experimental border at the time, looked all too much like music about music, but by 1976 it was collapsing under its technical excesses, prompting many to lose patience with this sonic laboratory, creating a renewed demand for immediacy and accessibility. Heavy metal's growth was maybe non-linear and gradual throughout this decade as a result, and obviously punk stepped in to satisfy this craving, calling back to the grounded energy of early rock and roll. Between these two poles, glam, 50s revivalism, and a flat-out rejection of rock altogether in the form of something like disco, all placed competing and contradictory expectations on what it even meant to play rock and roll at this time. In the mid-70s, the vagaries of early metal did gradually come into focus, however, creating something that could justifiably be characterized as novel, prompting journalists to sharpen their lexical knives. Black Sabbath's Sabotage, for instance, offered some of their heaviest material, coinciding with Judas Priest's dramatic pivot on Sad Wings of Destiny the following year, Motorhead's first rumblings on Motorhead and Rainbow's Rainbow Rising, all laying the foundations for what became the new wave of British heavy metal. This is the moment of transition from accident of evolution to self-conscious entity. The moment the term heavy metal becomes associated with that sound and those parameters, imitators will arrive keen to adopt these colours. When Judas Priest actively embraced heavy metal as a label, sharpening its sonic and aesthetic identity in the process, any artist in the vicinity was forced to take a position on the label itself. See Motorhead's dogged loyalty to their rock and roll credentials, for example.
So rock and roll is heavy metal is rock and roll, yeah? Did you see Motorhead as being part of that movement with Maiden and Priest and
No.
Saxon and those bands that came out at that time?
Oh, we were before then anyway. I mean, we were 76, you know. I thought we were more like a punk band, really. I mean, if you shut your eyes and forget our history, then we are a punk band. Sound more like a punk band than a, metal band to me, I always thought.
They were defining themselves in relation to the label itself. But exactly what Judas Priest achieved with Sad Wings of Destiny still looks oddly schizophrenic. Were they backpedaling on Black Sabbath's inroads into prog with straightforward hard rock? Or were they solidifying a new form of narrative ambition distinct from the convoluted bloat of progressive rock? Both could be true at once, and these bipolar motivations have all but defined every form of metal since. Looking at Judas Priest's classic trilogy, starting with 1976's Sad Wings of Destiny as a benchmark, it subverted these dilemmas by basically picking neither path. In this regard, it was oddly centrist, embracing the need for energy and urgency arising from the political chaos of the 70s, but fostering near limitless ambition in terms of virtuosity and compositional reach. Early metal contained these two contradictory impulses by embracing unself-conscious theatre, romantic sensitivity, and an active celebration of Wagnerian bombast, considered vulgar by progheads and outright ridiculous by traditional rock purists. But something in this strange brew resonated with a third audience. The ethos of early heavy metal solidified at the intersection between two competing impulses, between the barbarian and the philosopher, a walking contradiction. New album bands drew a line in the sand by embracing their genre musically and psychologically. Its contradictory nature repelled their nearest neighbours, seeing in it either regression or outright farce. Its status as a failed state among subcultures took decades to recover. Its appropriation of biker gang tribalism and strict dress codes of denim, leather, and long hair, as distinct from both punk and the early hippie wave of the 60s, only furthered the impression that metal was an amalgamation of by then tired countercultural traits. In this sense, metal was by definition retro, the purest and most unapologetically dramatic reassertion of rock and roll values in defiance of art house deviations rife in the mid-70s, an ethos embodied in a band like Motorhead, for example. Yet it still contained within it a desperate need to experiment and push at the boundaries of rockist convention, displaying a remarkable ability to contain these competing forces for long periods. It's this unself-conscious regression combined with careless creativity that chimed with a population large enough to create a sui generis movement, one existing proudly outside of the mainstream ecosystem. No alleyway was left unexplored, no affectation considered too vulgar, no artistic statement too ambitious. There is no room for hesitation or inauthenticity. From this angle, metal looked, for all its historicism, deeply wedded to the present. New album bands were ultimately unable to resolve their centrism, however. Listening back to the key releases of this time, their albums are every bit as bipolar as Sabbath's opening run. Guitar Symphony sits comfortably alongside Boner Rock. This in part is due to generational factors maybe. New album was the last boomer metal subgenre, its adherents having grown up on early rock and roll. This left a lasting sentiment in their music they were unable to fully transcend. It wasn't until the mid-80s and the emergence of a generation raised on the polarities of the 70s in rock cinema scores at one end and punk's urgent sincerity at the other that metal saw a way to resolve this contradiction. As genres become conscious of their existence, they tend to follow reliable and mappable cycles. A loosely connected underground solidifies into a community. Creative self-confidence, usually retrospectively understood as the genre's peak. Commercial success. An avant-garde emerges, pushing the boundaries of genre even further into various progressive iterations. With each new phase, factionalism grows. Authenticity is contested. The territory is carved up between what counts as sincere and what should be considered appropriation or fake. Not every metal genre follows this cycle, of course. Glam, alt, or power metal have certainly taken different trajectories. But the framework is useful for understanding how a lust for nostalgia arises even in relatively young genres. Take early thrash. In its underground phase, this was undoubtedly regressive, a combative pushback against the arguably futurist androgyny of the 80s. Thrash's concoction of Motorhead and early hardcore punk with New Wobbin melodicism was something of a conservative move in this context. But once thrash reached stage 2, creative self-confidence, there is no denying the extent to which it lost itself in its own presence, so to speak, a powerful, artistic vehicle giving voice to Cold War fear, addiction, neoliberal anxiety, anti-war sentiment, and occult, sci-fi or horror themes. This short period, falling roughly between 1984 and 88, witnessed some of metal's most memorable material. Thrash's avant-gardist turn maybe predated its major commercial successes. Artists like Voivod, Watchtower, Coroner, DBC, along with progressive moves from Metallica and Megadeth, all were attempts to explode any remaining confines of restriction within guitar music. The raw energy and immediacy of thrash was diverted into ambitious and measured albums that were designed to be treated as such. Complex and lengthy works of layered composition offered to posterity stood in direct contrast to the raw, grassroots anarchy of the movement in its infancy. A period that was hastily ended by a dramatic pivot toward alternative, basic groove metal or heavy rock by the turn of the decade. Many genres of metal follow this rough cycle, death metal hitting similar beats to thrash just a few years later. The energy and work ethic required for informal underground movements to reach the artistic maturity of stage 2 bakes within it a shelf life. The creative need to annex the present is inevitably unsustainable. Often, as in the case of black metal, the underground stage was defined by nostalgia, a need to reassert simplicity and authenticity in a world growing too complex. Unlike contemporary nostalgia, though, it was rarely characterized as such, more often couched in terms of going back to basics, being DIY or no nonsense. Nostalgia, if it was present at all alongside the opposing drive to discover a new sound, was wrapped up in a complex network of other and sometimes contradictory motivations. Younger acts were often reacting to their immediate present as opposed to the long view of history adopted by a modern retro fandom. Artists would look back only a handful of years for context, place and purpose within metal's evolution. For example, Darkthrone, in shunning the progressive direction of death, looked to Celtic Frost and early Sodom a mere handful of years earlier for inspiration, and in doing so stumbled on the new almost by chance along with a handful of their contemporaries. What unified the disparate threads of metal winding their way through the 80s was much the same as the original paradox at the heart of New Wobbin. A superficially regressive movement lifting the aesthetic of biker gangs, old-school rock and roll, barbarism and an anti-modernist escapism. This was cloaking what was genuinely thoughtful, sophisticated and albeit unconsciously forward-looking musical movements. It demanded of rockism something beyond a commercialized, radio-friendly product, but refused to surrender this project to the unanchored esotericism of prog rock alone. But the 80s also saw metal take on a second, more abstract form of nostalgia, idealizing antiquity. Metal began lifting material from history, literature, 19th century romanticism and ancient mythology with a passion that went beyond mere inspiration. One way to read this is a simple yearning for some imagined past of heroes' journeys and moral binaries, but it could also be understood as a clumsy search for some form of long-term historical continuity, a desire to reassert the power of myth on the imagination in the face of Cold War rationalism and all its accompanying horrors. There were notable exceptions to this. Doom metal was perhaps the first metal genre to explicitly celebrate its nostalgia. Albums like St. Vitus's Born Too Late, released in 1986, functioning as a rallying cry for metalheads, nonplussed by Rain in Blood, released the same year, illuminating the polarity represented by both albums. It wasn't just that one played fast and one played slow, it was everything about St. Vitus's aesthetic. They dressed like hippies, eschewing the spikes and leather of their peers. The cover art for their previous album, Hallow's Victim, mimicked the hazy austerity of the 70s, in defiance of the rich occult and fantasy imagery that was industry standard for metal by the 80s. Their sound was warm and organic, a rich, mellow haze of 60s psychedelia, comforting next to the frantic death drives of thrash. They, along with Pentagram, The Obsessed, and later the likes of Sleep and Acid King, would anticipate the third coming of this genre in the mid to late 2000s. The characterization of doom metal as the oldest form of metal comes from overlooking the explicit nostalgia of these earlier bands, who saw themselves as reaching back to a more authentic form of heavy rock music as a rejection of the hypercharged 80s. But there's no denying that by the 80s, metal's confidence in its own relevance, its creativity and commercial success as well, resulted in a powerfully contemporary form of music. Metal was uniquely situated to express the feeling of living in the 80s and all the contradictions and anxieties this entailed. By the 90s, the picture had become uncomfortably complex. Explicit futurism, coupled with ever more dramatic leaps into the past, a new maturity juxtaposed with crippling hesitancy, all overshadowed by a growing millennial unease. If we could generalize at all about metal in the 90s, it was never boring. The regicide of thrash and death metal at the hands of alt and later nu metal, the final irrelevance of heavy metal as the overweening sincerity of the 80s vibe shifted into the dripping sarcasm and irony of the 90s, the brief projectile of second wave black metal that inadvertently forced metal to confront capital P politics again. Out of these convulsions, metal dared to push not just at its own borders, but at the very edges of what contemporary music could or should do. But at the other end, it looked weakened and paralysed by its own visibility, unsure of how to proceed in response to fan expectation and a growing demand for subtlety and vulnerability following the simple moral binaries of the 80s. The decade started with the final gasp of thrash metal. Megadeth had written their magnum opus in the form of Rust in Peace. Voivod had just released Nothing Face as a final farewell to metal altogether. And in 1991, Metallica finally turned off thrash's life support machine with the Black Album, and death metal had grown from runt of the litter to clan chieftain by the 90s. In one sense, this was metal finally shedding its rock roots, accessing new frameworks of music theory and abstraction in order to sever any lasting bonds with the surrounding musical landscape entirely. Works like The Red in the Sky Is Ours, Unquestionable Presence, Blessed Are the Sick and Nestbife were birthed from minds ripe with originality, offering an utterly novel approach to guitar-based music. They were also, for a time at least, unconcerned with history. Second wave black metal, initially a nostalgic reaction against death metal's growing progressive confidence, stumbled onto its own route to capturing the present. Works like Transylvanian Hunger, Vislyset Ta Us, Far Away from the Sun, Dol Guldur, and many others pushed at the boundaries of metal as a form of neo-romanticism wholly divorced from anything that had come before. Through these dual pillars of extremity grew a whole ecosystem of experimental subgenres, some detaching themselves from metal entirely, all resulting in music whose relevance is stubbornly evergreen. The 90s also saw explicit attempts to engage in futurism as industrial metal entered its mature phase. The early lineage of Throbbing Gristle, Swans, Killing Joke, Fall of Because, later Godflesh, and Head of David had as much in common with maybe hardcore punk and grindcore as it did anything remotely metal through its repetitive, monotonous rhythmic pulses motivating droning guitar chords or tonally neutral static. The rise of Godflesh, Pitch Shifter, Scorn and Sonic Violence in the UK, and Ministry, Fear Factory and Skin Chamber in the States took industrial into the new decade though. Despite the potential in blending metal's expansive conceptual ambition with the futurist nihilism of electronica, its creative peak was very short-lived, being swept quickly into the emerging umbrella of alt-rock. Whatever the term alt-rock means now, one way of viewing its emergence is the punk mentality withering on the Gen X vine. In Capitalist Realism, Mark Fisher noted that Nirvana were, in a sense, the embodiment of the punk philosophy at the point of its final defeat at the hands of the establishment. Kurt Cobain's anguish went far deeper than political protest. His was a despair at the emptiness of what constituted a life worth living in consumerism. The futurism of industrial metal was not an optimistic one. It maintained a persistent vulnerability despite the increasingly violent nature of the music by the early 90s. A vulnerability that made it easily absorbable into alt-rock fragility. Black metal, in its purest form, was unique in this regard. By its very nature, it could not be repackaged for a commercial audience. The project of extremity in metal reached an endgame with the trial of Varg Vikernes, the murder of Euronymous, his own adversarial public persona as well, and the genre's crudeness, orders of magnitude over what had come previously. Black metal had, in a sense, crossed the Rubicon, and gone where other countercultures, even its nearest neighbours in metal, were unable to tread. For this crime alone, black metal was banished by large segments of the metal populace, disallowed, held as unserious, primitive, problematic and otherwise mocked. In this regard, bands like Cradle of Filth and Dimmu Borgir became useful idiots in its rehabilitation as a defanged entertainment product. Having participated and actively nurtured the scene at the start of the decade, Cradle of Filth and their ilk later brought the genre back into the fold by shaving off its rougher edges and lashing out at the genre's original fan base for their alleged narrow-mindedness.
I want to read something you said and just want to know if it's something you still feel or what you meant by it. In reference to Dark Throne, everyone was copying that look and posing around in the forest with sticks. I just think it's a sham. It's like trying to recreate magic with nothing other than a bit of grease paint and all these people saying how evil and stuff they are.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. There was a period where every band that was coming out had to look like upturned badgers. And it just, when you stood back from it, you just thought, it's all a little ridiculous, really. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Despite these efforts, black metal's status as the problem child of metal has persisted to this day in some regard. Metal's relationship with commercial success also became more complicated. Generally speaking, metal of the 80s retained a degree of authenticity in the eyes of its fanbase, even as it soared to greater heights of mainstream attention, something neatly demonstrated by Iron Maiden's stratospheric rise, despite their repeated refusals to appear on primetime TV shows like Top of the Pops, due to the programme's insistence that all the acts that appear on the show mime.
So there is a brand new number one. It's also the highest new entry in the chart. It's called Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter. Happy New Year, Iron Maiden.
Despite a ban by the BBC, Iron Maiden's Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter went straight to the top spot.
Commercial metal in the 90s felt somehow different to this. Despite the enormous popularity of albums like Roots and the unprecedented success of early nu metal, there was a growing feeling that this was somehow detached from what they intuitively, if inarticulately, knew to be the spirit of metal. Whilst this was not solely a function of nostalgia, it's certainly true that younger fans coming of age in the late 90s, greeted by this new wave of pre-packaged pop metal, found themselves lamenting the fact that they had somehow missed a golden age which had passed them by just a few years previous. Just out of reach, but endlessly play back to them from the enormous archives of footage now circulating on numerous music TV channels. This would explicitly manifest as nostalgia by the late 2000s as the effects of generational shifts within metal became more dramatic. But in the 90s, this was foreshadowed by how some older acts responded to the increasingly complex picture they were presented with. Anthrax saw new creative energy in their collaboration with Public Enemy. Judas Priest aggressively reasserted their credentials through an album like Painkiller, a last gasp for true metal values before Halford embraced industrial music as a newly relevant outlet. Slayer's covers album, Undisputed Attitude, explicitly attempted to bring punk to heel in the face of the alleged illegitimacy of early pop-punk. Metallica embraced alt-rock vulnerability with Open Arms. The 90s saw metal detach itself from the present. This took the form of increasingly avant-gardist abstractions in response to the state of flux that swept through its traditional heartlands as the certainties of Cold War bipolarity collapsed. A kind of perpetual present, a tunnel vision that saw only the current moment and how one could manipulate it. But the seeds of a more explicit, nostalgic impotence were also being sown in direct response to a world that no longer made sense to many.
Well, what goes up must come down, and down, and down.
By the 2000s, the long hangover kicked in. Newness and innovation were expelled to experimental hinterlands, odd outliers tweaking at the borders of pre-existing styles and forms. Whilst an argument could be made for metal becoming its boldest and most daring at this time, the very frameworks of musical analysis were shifting beneath metal's feet, renegotiating the terms under which new material was even assessed. One interesting vignette offered by Simon Reynolds in his book Retromania is a shift in music journalism and commentary regarding influence. Album reviews, and indeed interviews with bands themselves, will prominently feature lists of reference points and antecedents that influence new music. But this is a decidedly new phenomenon. Previously, if influence was mentioned at all, it would be brief and unimportant. This is partly due to the fact that there was just less material to be influenced by in the past, but also the fact that access was limited by geography and money. By the 2000s, originality itself also became the metric in music chat. New releases were seen as either explicitly pining for a lost golden age or attempting to contrive futurism through a once-removed nostalgia by mashing pre-existing genres together. A seemingly insatiable compulsion to harvest imagery and symbolism from the past as a shortcut to envisaging the future. One way of contrasting the metal of the 80s with the 90s, maybe, is through the Cold War, for instance. 80s metal was a means of metabolizing apocalyptic fears and political hypocrisy. 90s metal tried to chart a course through the surreal territory ostensibly at the end of history. 2000s metal is distinct in kind from both of these approaches, in its detachment from the world around it itself. Antaius began the decade by claiming to be anti-God, anti-music, anti-you. There was no longer a meaningful way to respond to reality. Metal was moving out of phase with society and entering its post-modernity. A computer in every home bred a new generation of quiet librarians and archivists attempting to document the anarchic frenzy of activity produced by previous decades. Digital platforms stoked a new war zone, the stakes of which could well define the very idea of artistic ownership. This was the terrain on which the new would be negotiated, once removed from the music itself. 9/11, the Iraq War, financial collapse and the austerity that followed, all were met with a deafening silence from a metal community desperately contending with or hopelessly preoccupied by the infrastructure through which their art was distributed and recorded, leaving little room for meaningful cultural responses to the decade that saw the West's end-of-history chickens come home to roost. The tone of the discourse on creativity and originality shifted from spirited discussions on the best new releases to iconoclastic sermons on the very possibility of originality itself. Music is made and understood in a very different way today than it was in 1999. The most significant developments to occur in the 2000s were technological rather than artistic. With that in mind, it seems almost too perfect that the 2000s should have kicked off with one of the world's biggest metal bands picking a fight with Napster. The budding file-sharing site was able to pose as the plucky young upstart, meaning that whatever the rights and wrongs of Metallica's actions, metal was now the establishment, willing to join the interests of capital in bullishly persecuting grassroots enthusiasm, paving the way for tech to claim the role of a new countercultural movement. Despite Metallica's victory in the courts over the file-sharing trailblazers Napster, the cat was already out of the bag, with sites like LimeWire and SoulSeek nurturing fledgling online communities around ready access to history's libraries. Music's dispersal into the limitless digital realm had a profound impact on the nature of fandom. Gone were the days of grassroots zines, austere record collectors saving up for the monthly purchase, and overworked promoters coordinating scenes from the ground up. Gone too were the days of musicians claiming ultimate ownership over the artistic raw materials fueling this culture. The early 2000s were the dawn of a new age of atomized consumption. The metalhead had already garnered a stereotype for obsessiveness and fixation on the obscurities of lore. The music nerd hunched over their computer begins to look like the logical conclusion to this. Armed with an Alexandrian hard drive stuffed with MP3s, a compulsive urge to document, categorize, and star-rate every moment of metal's history to date. Online forums, blogs, chat rooms, and review sites like Metal Archives allowed the fan to offer their musings to posterity. The interpretation of art took on a newfound permanence and significance. It also became a democratic, participatory arena, where all opinions have equal validity, visibility, and were distributed to a wider global audience than was ever thought possible, all in near real time. The past, present, and future of metal's previously joyful spontaneity was brought to heel under 24/7 commentary. The promises of the internet's earliest converts in its anarchic utopian phase are hard to understate, but by the time the internet inserted itself into every home by the 2000s, the purpose of this novel utility was unclear. Was it an educational resource? A means to book your next holiday? A way to connect with strangers? Or a new tool for shopping? As millennials were left to pick apart the deep disillusionment brought to the surface by Gen X, symbolised a little too perfectly by the fires of Woodstock 99, this new tool would become the very means by which millennials negotiated their identity and understood the world around them, their coming of age coinciding with the coming of age of a new form of technology, the significance and purpose of which no one could quite grasp. One immediate effect was for metal fandom to detach itself from the limitations of geography, of the physical scene itself, becoming a kind of choose-your-own-adventure thanks to the tireless archival work of the internet's earliest converts. Youth culture could be experienced and appropriated in its entirety from the comfort of home. But if the Retromania complex had begun to seep into the psychology of fandom, it had not yet explicitly bled into the music itself. Reading the 2000s as the total retreat of metal fandom into bedrooms and basements to quietly engage in a kind of compulsive cultural bureaucracy is only half the story and not entirely true. The 2000s also witnessed a glut of new music, modest by today's standards but obscene in its excesses by any other measure. From bedroom black metal to Iron Maiden's newfound mojo upon Bruce Dickinson's return, to 70s revivalism in the juiced-up stoner doom of Electric Wizard, to death metal's frugal nods to maturity in Gorguts and Immolation, to releases from Slayer, Metallica and Ozzy Osbourne that could be read as the last howl of an old guard, betraying their inability to digest what new metal spelt for their artistic relevance. The 2000s saw a general aura of inauthenticity seep into culture as well, the consequences of which we are still living with today. Aligning with some imagined past allows us to ride in the slipstream of its authenticity. Equally, mining the raw materials of earlier genres to create hybrid forms allowed many bands to create a veneer of innovation. The former is unproblematically Retromania. For instance, the moment Darkthrone finally broke with black metal and released The Cult Is Alive in 2006, they signalled their desire for fans to re-acknowledge their credentials as the real deal in the wake of their dubious run from ravishing grimness to sardonic wrath. The latter, however, is a form of Retromania by sleight of hand. Who could deny the explicit futurism of an album like Monumension, for example? Yet it was fashioned from 70s prog, thrash, and whatever black metal spare parts Enslaved still had lying around. Despite the dramatically different experiences offered by these albums, both could not escape the general whiff of performativity, flavours of the past repackaged. Nowhere was this more apparent than in death metal, circling the same territory since about 1994 with little sign of purpose. By the late 2000s, it discovered the mileage that could be gained from simply repeating the past. The late 80s was now long enough ago to be considered novel. Asphyx, Autopsy, Entrails, Atheist, and many more began to cash in on their legacy. Respectable albums followed for sure, but this would usher in a seemingly unbreakable conflation between authenticity and old-school values by the late 2000s. A genuine and sincere compulsion to eke out new creative spaces is traceable in the 2000s, but its traction within a historically obsessed and non-scene-orientated fanbase was limited. Like Averse Sephira, Gorguts, Crimson Massacre, Immolation, Beherit, all fruitlessly swam against this tide. But underlying all of this, whether it be Stoner Doom's Brave March Backwards, slick brands in the likes of Behemoth, Dimmu Borgir and Dark Funeral, black metal's plea for rock and roll credentials via black and roll, or death metal's circling of the drain, underlying it all was the simple fact that metal had become too self-conscious, a hyper-awareness that heralded the arrival of its post-modernity, as it shifted from a loosely bound community of artisans to a globally connected movement of atomized entrepreneurs. A homogenization took place at the behest of new digital platforms that demanded of their users a one-size-fits-all branding strategy. Metal was not overtly fixated on the retro just yet, but the moment Asphyx released Death the Brutal Way in 2009, a newfound fascination with the past would take deep and lasting root. What made the proverbial old school great and why? How do we recapture that naive yet addictive spirit of freedom and joyful creativity? These questions would obsess the modern musician. The grassroots fixation with documenting the past on the one hand, and becoming one's own promoter, label, producer and manager, thanks to the new tools of social media on the other. All this meant that everyone was too busy to ask whether there was such a thing as too much content. The dangers of too much history went unnoticed. Albums became state-of-the-nation addresses, one artist's appraisal of the present as opposed to an expression of their will to define it. Metal, by the end of the 2000s, this equilibrium had been lost entirely. The music curator had well and truly won the day. If we understand the history of metal as one extended binary automata, an eternal push and pull between the forces of regression and progress, one way of looking at metal's canon is to view it as works that achieved an equilibrium between these two forces: new wobben, early thrash, late 80s death metal, second wave black metal. Metal lore is notoriously contested, I know, yet it displays a remarkably stubborn consensus regarding its canon. This persistence can in part be explained by the fact that these works arose at these unique moments of flux. Since its inception, metal was a self-mythologizing subculture, the self-sustaining community of artisans, fed by an army of teenage recruits whose rites of passage include retaining an intimate knowledge of the subculture's history and mores, are engaged in a constant process of research, revision, discussion, and interpretation. This hyper-self-awareness creates a paradox for the musicians themselves. As the factory floor of the movement, they are creatively free in the sense that anything goes: drama, extremity, aggression, orchestration, theatre, compositional complexity, and a vestigial tolerance for the flamboyance that is utterly disallowed in the restrained cool of parallel subcultures. But this freedom, it may well be an illusion when we consider that it must be understood and enjoyed within very strictly defined parameters which themselves are hotly disputed. Whenever metal has reached a state of total transcendence of time and place, it has not simply dispensed with these parameters, it has acted as if they never existed in the first place. This is why artists who self-consciously attempt to reach forward, various progressive subgenres for example, the futurism of industrial metal or post-black metal, they often appear oddly uncanny. They look like a new chapter in metal's evolution, but beneath the veneer they present as ghostly effigies formed of disparate spare parts from discarded histories, hastily stitched together in a desperate ploy for novelty. The internet poured gasoline on the already volatile compulsion for historical self-awareness in metal. In Retromania, Reynolds characterizes this compulsion to archive every fragment of our history facilitated by the internet as follows: "We have available to us, as individuals, but also at the level of civilization, immensely more space to fill with memorabilia, documentation, recordings, every kind of archival trace of our existence. And naturally, we are busy filling that space, even as its capacity continues to balloon. Yet, there is no evidence that we have significantly increased our ability to process or make good use of all that memory." Has metal made good use of all that memory? There are two ways to answer this question. One is a direct assessment of how the music itself has adapted in this new environment. The other is to look at the changing picture of metal's infrastructure through which the community sustains and understands itself. From a purely musical perspective, granting fans instant, free, and unlimited access to any moment in history has exacerbated a pre-existing compulsive nostalgia within metal fandom. Old school is now a subgenre tag in its own right. Artists born decades after the heyday of a particular style take great pride and care in imitating and recreating its every aesthetic detail: the design of promo flyers, the cassette revival, hand-drawn cover art, analog recording techniques, and obtaining period-correct gear. All are highly prized markers of quality. This old-school movement was in part a direct response to the cold digitization of the metal aesthetic in the late 90s and early 2000s. Everything from the garish album covers rendered on early Photoshop, the triggered drums and heavy-handed compression that led to rampant uniformity in sound, marketing campaigns and press releases that look more like corporate events than a subculture, festivals posing as theme parks and branded kitchenware. All this created a crisis of authenticity in the 2000s. The need to reassert DIY credentials makes sense in this context, and the internet was there, ready and waiting to aid in this quest. Thanks to the pioneering archival work of its early converts, it offered the most immediate escape from metal's assimilation into the culture industry by allowing younger musicians to simply rent their authenticity from the past. By definition, the music to emerge from this movement had a shelf life. There are only so many times we can analyse new albums in terms of its loyalty and treatment to specific historical markers. From Black Sabbath clones to old-school death metal, surely this demand has its limits. Perhaps more pertinently, however, as Reynolds points out, what happens when we run out of the past to revive? As urgent as this question may seem, it is not a fundamental concern to out and proud revivalists. Having selected their style and identified their audience, both parties are happy repeating a variation of the same moment in history ad infinitum. Fans like that thing you did, and they would like another one, please. This question should rather be addressed to the heir apparents of metal's future. From the facsimile of progressive death metal in a blood incantation, the lawless avant-gardism of a liturgy, the progressive pop metal of a Gojira, an Enslaved, a Meshuggah, the cut-and-paste metallic depth charges that find their way into Sleep Tokens material, or the push to dispense with metal music entirely and retain an as-yet ill-defined spirit of metal, all come up against the same roadblock: the limits of genre alchemy. The idea of genre alchemy is an important facet of musical evolution for sure, but the explicit iteration that arose in the early 2010s is notable for the cultural whiplash that it causes, a form of rampant postmodernism deliberately standing outside of context, unable to provide a context, a meaning or commentary on the present. From the overt historicism of Wardruna and Heilung to nu metal's redemption in the form of trap metal to any number of progressive or post-offshoots, these impulses are not so much about finding inspiration in other subgenres as they are a move to escape accountability to the present itself. The listening experience becomes a tour through a hastily assembled playlist on shuffle, connected by only the loosest of themes. Even the deeper dives into history taken by the fledgling Nordic folk movement, not so much retro as it is archaic, are a very postmodern response to conditions and events that appear to be running out of the individual's control, a direct descendant of Western counterculture's turning away from the Judeo-Christian globalism by embracing paganism. Nordic folk is another iteration of mining the past in order to give voice to a very modern disaffection with circumstance. But no matter how sincerely one attempts to pay homage to the music and traditions of European paganism, it continues to be defined by something exterior to the music itself. How historically accurate is it? Is it nothing more than a glorified reenactment? If it's conscious of its own inauthenticity, then what does it amount to as an artistic statement? Is it nothing more than an elaborate expression of panic, a resounding not that, to an economic order threatening the very future of humanity? Perhaps more pertinently, however, Nordic folk was able to reach a semblance of popularity for the same reason old-school revivalist genres were able to gain such traction. The last 20 years have been characterised by a total atomization of fandom. Everyone gets to have a say. New bands can form, record and release new material in the space of a week. Amateur critics can churn out reviews and commentary and share these with a global audience instantaneously. This represented a dramatic realignment of power within the music industry, but it has also meant the collapse of any consensus. Centres of gravity within a scene are harder to build and maintain, creating a lasting feeling of isolation. Retro doom metal, OSDM, pizza thrash, sword and sorcery power metal, and Nordic folk all managed to subvert this trend by creating comforting oases of the familiar. The tropes they appropriate, the aesthetic, worldview and image they put across are already established in the minds of the audience. In a sense, they have a ready-made fanbase, waiting and eager to lap up another reaffirmation of these agreed-upon symbols. Parallel to metal's expansion backwards or forwards through time has been its rise as a truly global phenomenon. The scene on the ground in Europe and North America may feel like an overly curated mess of false starts and replays, but the global picture tells a different story. In South America, China, the Middle East and India, one will find metal familiar but notable for a deeper sense of authenticity, a freer play with existing forms, something that represents an incremental but important shift away from the sudden bursts of productivity that defined pre-digital metal. In its very gradualism, newer forms of metal now emerging have the potential to create the foundations for a different way to understand its role and potential. Metal has taken one path in response to the internet and the changes it has imposed on contemporary culture, one that may have now reached the logical conclusion. The other possible future that has yet to fully emerge is a reckoning with the awesome power of the internet itself and what it offers to grassroots action, for groups of like-minded people to organise, share and sustain culture as a form of community, as well as an artistic outlet. This is where metal begins to look like a means by which to organise in defiance of the culture industry itself, regardless of its musical originality. In his essay Metal is Radical, metal academic David Burke states that, however, it must be admitted that currently the metal community is only partially conscious of its own endeavours. Most musicians are, quite rightly, caught up in the moment and the process, whilst juggling employment and family alongside. Here we also see the labour of love that typifies the metal subculture, its own world of micro-commerce sustained with limited recourse to big business. Hardly anyone makes money in metal, but it really doesn't seem to matter. Compared to most subcultures, the ratio of producer to consumer in metal is relatively high. If you're not in a band, you might be a promoter, a designer, a web developer, a journalist, which is one of the reasons that the culture has persisted and grown long after it was largely abandoned by major labels and removed from MTV. The devotion that metal inspires is truly a rhizomatic desiring production, which blossoms constantly into new intensities and radical disjunctions, dissonance, bizarre time signatures, genre fusion, etc., and can be harnessed to do more. Metal is a self-sustaining community of artisans. If you're not a musician, you're a promoter, an artist, a label owner, an amateur journalist. Even the average fan is so heavily invested in the culture that they go to great lengths to learn and retain the intimate details of a vast body of knowledge that's completely useless outside of the context of metal. They radically alter their physical image in order to be easily identifiable to others, often with a personal and professional cost. Metal's self-mythologization is from one angle an Achilles heel, certainly, but it could also be its greatest strength. Regardless of whether new music is more of the same, proudly historical or clumsily seeking something new, it will be nurtured, supported, analysed and ultimately given meaning under the care and protection of metal's proudly communal population. Whilst digital disillusionment continues apace, the internet could still be metal's most powerful tool, through which to renegotiate and understand its place in the world. A community of volunteers creating, distributing and evaluating important cultural artefacts, unshackled by the fiscal anxiety that has haunted grassroots movements of the past. So much for the infrastructure of metal. What of the music itself? It could be argued that the expectation that culture will always develop, move forward, present a clear, linear evolution. This is perhaps a brief post-war anomaly of the 20th century. Metal's obsession with its own evolution has blinded many, myself included, to the possibility and even necessity of stasis. In a recent article, art critic Jonathan Jones wrote of decadence that in the ancient world, the classical style was judged perfect, therefore timeless. You couldn't build anything better than a temple with a columned portico, or write anything better than Virgil, so change could only be for the worse. The very lack of innovation that some see today as decadence was praised by previous ages as stability, balance and harmony, nor is that only a Western view. Most civilizations have sought to triumph over the passage of time, from Buddhism aspiring to nirvana to a pre-communist China preserving its empire and reverence for the ancestors. This classical idea that continuity is culture's highest goal was so pervasive in pre-modern times that, in order to break from it, the 19th century avant-garde had to explicitly embrace decadence. If the choice was between living in an ordered, unchanging world and being branded decadent, French poets and artists chose the latter. Metal's canon casts its long shadow over the activities of modern bands, a lingering example of perfection that will never be bettered no matter how hard you labour, so why even bother innovating? Another way of looking at this was given by my podcasting buddy Joseph April, who argued that metal had become a kind of folk music, with people adopting and playing around with forms whilst the underlying architecture remains largely unchanged.
I personally of the opinion, I mean, when an artist can do something that feels new, even though that often is just tricking me by using things I'm not already familiar with, I don't get too caught up in that. Like, I kind of view metal as sort of a type of modern folk music, and so it's not really elements. It's elements that are constantly being reused, but at the same time, as long as an artist, I feel, is in their own personal way passionate about how they're communicating through it, then I can find something appealing in it.
Sorry, what you just said has kind of just given me a little epiphany. Innovation, if it comes at all, takes the form of small addendums and adjustments as opposed to great revolutionary leaps. Culture today, although it feels rather paradoxical, is moving slower than at any time since the Second World War. But what if this is simply a return to the historical norm? It's only a vestigial post-war expectation of ours that culture must be moving forwards all times. Why not luxuriate in the perfection already before us? Newer artists that do reach a degree of popularity, Ghost, Blood Incantation, Sleep Token and so on, look conspicuously chimerical. The justifications for their lionization all the more convoluted. Equally, the pushback from a once notoriously voracious fanbase appears half-hearted, exhausted, or perhaps just distracted by the fact that there's so much other content out there that one can go through life without ever having to engage with bands one finds distasteful. I did a quick Google of a few key words alongside metal, including retro, revival, nostalgia, and past. Of the top hits I could find, the most recent was from 2022. And this, I think, corroborates my suspicion that if metal is still nostalgic to the extent that it was in the 2010s, we all seem to have agreed to just not talk about it anymore. If that's the case, how do we characterize metal in 2025? Rather than maybe lamenting or celebrating what for a time felt like an endless carnival of revivalism, music is less obviously beholden to the past, But what's replacing this retromania is arguably not a renaissance of fresh sounds, but a form of cultural zombieism. An art form so exhausted and bereft of life that it can no longer adopt a conscious position toward its own history, instead accepting a life on autopilot. Hellfest recently offered perhaps the most dramatic symbol of metal's surrender to its past, the towering statue of Lemmy, within which is enshrined a portion of his ashes. If such blatant attempts by the past to annex the present were once openly ridiculed, see Dio's ghoulish hologram creeping across the globe for a posthumous tour, they are now openly championed by a culture apparently unable to escape deifying old hierarchies. The public face of metal resembles doomed Easter Islanders, a sophisticated and complex human organisation slowly divorcing itself from reality, cutting itself loose of prudence, fixated on obscenely elaborate dedications to posterity. Hellfest's post-COVID incarnation has now superseded Wacken as the most revered metal festival in the world, yet even a cursory scan of its recent lineups will reveal no headline acts under 15 years deep into their career, and a vast majority well over the 20 years in. But my purpose here, in revising metal's history in the context of nostalgia, is to ask if this past ever existed in the way we believe it did. Was metal ever as confident and self-assured as we often assume? The vast majority of its canonised works, taken in the grand arc of even post-war history, happened in an extremely short space of time, less than 20 years, give or take. Metal's narrative, the most basic Sam Dunn-esque Just So story it tells about itself, is largely agreed upon from 1970 to 1999, say, after which it becomes hotly disputed within the fan base. Agreed facts and who or what has been happening in the 21st century are very hard to come by. This, in part, is due to the fact that metal, no matter what form it takes, seems unable to escape not only the weight of all of this history, but its hyper-awareness of it. The pre-digital past is regarded as a time of prelapsarian frugality. If the capture of the present by the past goes on for long enough, metal becomes a kind of culture in suspended animation, a gradually disintegrating echo of a momentary blip. This is a distinct and decidedly insipid condition when taken against nostalgia. The default state of metal is a set of disconnected cultural streams now, loosely bound together by a half-remembered shared ancestry, now relegated to brands, affectations or vibes, the parameters of which are defined by a pseudo-scholarship unable or unwilling to interpret the symbolism of the past into anything more substantive than vague aesthetic auras. Within this environment, the resulting dearth of imagination leads many to conclude that the only way to revolutionize metal is to break with it entirely, hence the endless reams of chimerical avant-garde or experimental metal policing the borders of what innovation might look like. It's worth asking then, if innovation is desirable or even necessary. It's worth asking then, if the forms of metal that were innovated between, say, 1975 and 1995 are in fact open books, with reams of empty pages waiting to be filled with addendums and footnotes. And that's actually quite exciting. Measured against the life cycle of classical arts, metal is still in its infancy. Many musical forms have undergone little to no development for centuries, but people continue to be drawn to them by some deeper purpose than historical progress. But this may also require us to accept a new purpose for metal. The foundational documents of its many subgenres were products of very specific times and places, which allowed metal to play out its role as a symptom of the contradictions of liberal democracy at the tail end of the Cold War. The normalization of metal coincides with a moment when it seems increasingly disinterested in playing agent provocateur and simply accepting its duties as an idle pastime. But whenever it attempts to plug into the present, it appears forced, hesitant, and yes, inauthentic. Is there a way to continue fulfilling this role in an infinitely more complex social picture? Is there a way to overcome reverence for its past without collapsing into detached avant-gardism at one end and idle pastime at the other?